Welcome to the next lecture for our class. Today we'll discuss American involvement in the Vietnam War, America's longest war. There are a few main themes to be addressed in this presentation. First of all, we'll trace the escalation of American involvement in the war by looking at how different presidential administrations increased U.S. involvement and activity. That'll be the bulk of what we'll address. One of the things that you'll also see would be the impact of the war on American society, particularly protests against the war. At the end of this, you'll want to be able to evaluate the policies that led the U.S. into the war and the U.S. actions during the war. So why did the United States become involved? Well, it was all part of the Cold War and the goal that the Americans had to contain the spread of communism. Remember that containment policy addressed in a previous presentation? The United States couldn't do anything about where the Soviet Union already had control, but had to contain any and all future expansion. Well, the containment policy was implemented in Southeast Asia and Vietnam. The United States wanted to stop the spread of communism into new areas. There's one other observation I'd like to make. I don't do this all the time, but every once in a while I do like to identify the different sources that I've used for these presentations. I think the best single volume study of American involvement in the Vietnam War is called Vietnam, America's Longest War by George Herring. This book is where I'm getting a lot of the information for this lecture. We'll explore the early stages and beginnings of American involvement in the war next. We'll start with a bit of background. Now, I don't know if everyone is aware of this, but Vietnam was actually a colony of France prior to World War II. During the war, it was occupied by Japan. After the war, Vietnam in many ways was divided into a northern section, which was supported by the Soviet Union and tended to have communist leaders, and South Vietnam, which was supported by democratic leaders in the United States. The beginning of American activities actually started with money. In 1950, kind of as the Cold War was really ratcheting up, the United States gave $20 million to support anti-communists who were in South Vietnam. This was undertaken by the Truman administration, and you see the official portrait of Harry Truman on the right. After Harry Truman left office, beginning in 1953, we see the start of a program called Nation Building. This began when Dwight Eisenhower was president. His goal, and throughout this whole nation-building process, was to maintain an independent, non-communist South Vietnam. Dwight Eisenhower explained it this way. He argued that, well, if South Vietnam was to fall to communism, then the so-called domino effect would take place. Japan and other countries in that area would also fall to communism. Eisenhower was committed to nation building, and by the end of his administration, there were about 600 advisors in Vietnam. John Kennedy became president in 1961, and he accepted this policy of nation building, but he really took a middle course. He supported this independent, non-communist South Vietnam, but he did not want to lose South Vietnam to communism, so to speak, but he was not fully committed to American fighting. So there weren't hundreds of thousands of soldiers there fighting. However, when he left office after his assassination, there were 16,000 American troops in Vietnam. The bottom line so far with beginnings is that we see a slow increase in the U.S. commitment in Vietnam, beginning with Truman and continuing with Eisenhower and Kennedy. After Kennedy's assassination, we'll see a large escalation of American involvement in the war, beginning with the Johnson administration. An incident that took place in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964 actually led to U.S. increased commitment in Vietnam. It involved a battleship called the Maddox. The arrow on the map is pointing to the Gulf of Tonkin, which is located in the waters outside of North Vietnam. It was engaged in what the U.S. called electronic espionage. Essentially, it was spying. Well, it was apparently attacked one time. The U.S. government didn't do anything about it. Then they reported that they were attacked again. The U.S. government then acted. The reason why the word apparently is there is that the second attack may or may not have taken place. It was during a storm, and a sonar man said, "Hey, we're under attack." And later they reported, maybe we weren't under attack, we're not exactly sure. Regardless, after this second incident, President Lyndon Johnson asked for the power to respond to a possible attack. Lyndon Johnson is shown here, and he took over the White House after John Kennedy's death. He went to Congress and he asked for the authority to retaliate against this attack on an American ship. While the president serves as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, the president does not have the authority to declare war. So he went to the House and the Senate and asked for permission to respond. We see the United States Capitol here. Congress responded with the so-called Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964. This allowed the president to, quote, take all necessary measures to prevent the expansion of communism in Vietnam and to stop communist aggression. Essentially, what did this do? Well, it gave the legal justification for the president to send troops into combat, yet it stopped short of a declaration of war. One thing that's important to point out with this Tonkin Resolution is that this passed overwhelmingly in both the House and the Senate. And you can see the figures there. Early on in 1964, the American people supported American involvement in Vietnam. That would not be the case throughout the entirety of the war, but early on, this vote reflects that support. Now, you may be saying to yourself, what in the world is a resolution authorizing force? Well, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution dealt with American involvement in Vietnam. Less than a week after the attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon in 2001, Congress gave President Bush at that time the authority to send troops and to respond to the attacks on the World Trade Center. And so you see a portion of that resolution authorizing President Bush to respond in 2001. Once Lyndon Johnson had the authority to increase the U.S. commitment, we see a major escalation of American activity. Initially, Johnson held back on sending additional troops, but in 1965, an American base in South Vietnam was attacked. The name of that base was called Pleiku, and that's when Johnson responded. Johnson responded to that attack on U.S. forces with what was called Operation Rolling Thunder. He sent 50,000 troops to Vietnam. He wasn't going to do anything half-measured. 50,000 troops was a major increased commitment. In 1965, we see the beginnings of some protests on the part of younger people to this increased American commitment. Maybe one of the best examples would be when about 25,000 protesters went to Washington, D.C., and you can see some images from that where many young men who were drafted to fight in the war, they were burning their draft cards. It's important to note that the majority of the American people actually still supported the war in the mid-1960s, but by 1967 and particularly by 1968, we see a shift. But early on, the students began to protest about 1965. This escalation of American forces began in 1965. By 1968, there were about 500,000 American troops committed to fighting in Southeast Asia. Sometimes it can be helpful to see a chart like this. It identifies the increase and decrease of combat troops in Vietnam. Notice the major escalation by 1968, early 1969. There were over 500,000 troops in Southeast Asia at that time. Once it hit that peak, we do see a gradual decrease in the number of forces, but you can see it started slow, peaked in 68 or 69, and then gradually dropped. Next, I'd like to talk about the Tet Offensive and how opposition to the war increased and events that took place in 1968, which is really very much of a turning point in American history. In late 1967 and in early 1968, military leaders and politicians were declaring, hey, victory's just around the corner. We're almost there. And then about the third week of January in 1968, a major offensive was undertaken by the North Vietnamese, and it caught the Americans and the South Vietnamese completely by surprise. On the left, you can see the map where those red stars are located. There were attacks on just about every major and even mid-range city and settlement in South Vietnam. This was initially very much a military success for the North. However, they had overextended themselves and they were forced to retreat after a while. While those North Vietnamese forces were forced to retreat, a credibility gap had developed between the American people and government officials. Government officials were saying, hey, victory's just around the corner. Yet the casualty rates were incredibly high, beginning with that Tet Offensive. And so here's where you see American people beginning to question U.S. involvement in the war. And on the right, you can see this chart that identifies the number of combat deaths for Americans in Vietnam. In many ways, the Tet Offensive was a turning point in American involvement in the Vietnam War. Prior to the Tet Offensive, most of the American people supported U.S. involvement. However, opposition to the war grew dramatically after this credibility gap became clear. Here we see some protesters who are upset about American involvement in the war, and they want the government to bring an end to the war immediately. So this is just one of many examples of increased protest that the American people had after the Tet Offensive, and this credibility gap became wider and wider. This was embodied by the so-called counterculture movement of the 1960s. Young people looked at their parents' generation and identified a range of different traits. Men often would wear a three-piece suit. Their hair was cut short, often in a crew cut. Their parents were in monogamous relationships. And while there was some abuse of alcohol, alcohol was the drug of choice of their parents' generation. Do you remember this slide from the 1920s? In that decade, a generation gap was developing between children and their parents. Well, in the 1960s, the same thing was happening, although in the 1960s, it seemed to be deeper and broader. This deeper and broader generation gap could be seen by comparing the parents' generation with the so-called baby boom generation. If their parents wore three-piece suits, baby boomers, well, they would wear jeans. If their parents had crew cuts, well, they would have long hair. Their parents may have been in monogamous relationships. Well, free love was something that was spreading, particularly in certain parts of the country, like in California. And if alcohol was the drug of choice for their parents' generation, illegal drugs became much more common for this baby boom generation. We can see the impact of this counterculture movement with some images. Remember these on the left and the right? These were during World War II, and it encouraged people to enlist, and real men make the Navy. Well, in the middle, we see another here, protesting American involvement in the Vietnam War. Girls say yes to boys who say no to fighting in Vietnam. It's a total change in attitude about people who were in the service and fighting between World War II and the Vietnam era. Music festivals became very common, and they were associated with this counterculture movement, the most famous of which took place in Woodstock, New York in 1969. We see some images of that music festival here. Now, there were a lot of important bands during the 1960s, but the most popular and the most influential clearly were the Beatles. When they arrived in the United States in 1964, they had early hits like She Loved You, Yeah, 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 and I Want to Hold Your Hand, and She was just 17, you know what I mean? These songs that, were about love and young people and that. Well, later on, the Beatles were associated with the counterculture movement, and they had songs like Lucy in the Sky with diamonds. Some people argued that this celebrated the use of LSD. Just to let you know, John Lennon said no, that's not what it was. It was actually based upon an art project that his son, who was like in kindergarten, brought home, and he said, this is a drawing of Lucy in the Sky with diamonds. Regardless, people associated the use of illegal drugs with a lot of this counterculture movement, and we see an example of this here. The United States was divided very much politically, just as it is today in many ways. Well, the counterculture movement had a major impact and driving factor. See, a lot of young people were associated with the Democratic Party because a lot of their activities, yet they were frustrated at American involvement in the Vietnam War. Well, Lyndon Johnson became a victim, so to speak, of the Tet Offensive, and he decided not to run for re-election in 1968. Further demonstrating the violence of American society and American culture in 1968, Robert Kennedy, who was trying to get the Democratic nomination after Lyndon Johnson died, he was assassinated. On the left, we see some violence at the Democratic Convention, which took place in Chicago. Anti-war protesters clashed with the police, and it seemed as if the nation was just coming apart at the seams. I just want to stop for a second and just reinforce some things from this era of 1968, this year of turmoil. The Tet Offensive took place in that year. Robert Kennedy was assassinated in that year, and I've mentioned both of those. Well, that was also the year that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. So violence was something that was really characteristic of American society. Well, 1968 was also a presidential election year, and Richard Nixon ran for the White House, and he promised that he would return the nation to an era of law and order. I'd like to explore some of the policies adopted by Richard Nixon next. Nixon assumed the presidency in 1969, and he outlined a policy that he called Vietnamization. When he was running for president, he said he had a secret plan to end American involvement in the Vietnam War, and he began to implement it when he came to the White House. First of all, the United States would gradually withdraw forces from Vietnam. Secondly, the U.S. would train and then equip the South Vietnamese to fight for themselves. Third, the United States began negotiations to end its involvement in the war. Well, the North Vietnamese realized what was going on in the United States, so they refused to negotiate. Things got to be so bad as when the diplomats would talk to one another, they couldn't even agree on the size of the table where the future bargaining sessions would take place. In order to place pressure on the North Vietnamese, the United States expanded its bombing campaign in the north and invaded neutral countries like Cambodia and Laos. These clearly violated the authority that Congress had given the president. President Nixon lied about it. He was breaking the law. And when this was discovered, oh boy. Once these illegal activities undertaken by the Nixon administration were discovered, students protested all over the country. One of the more famous protests took place at Kent State. The state militia was called out, shots were fired, and 4 students were killed at Kent State in 1970. We see an image of the horror associated with this here. I'm going to go back to some of the music from this era, and it reflected the mood of many of the young people. And so on the upper left, there was a song written by Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, 4 Dead in Ohio. The Doors came out with a song called The Unknown Soldier, just lamenting the fact that so many people were dying. And on the upper right, we see a song by CCR, Creedence Clearwater Revival, called Fortunate Son, where a lot of rich people were able to escape their participation in the war, yet if you were poor, you ended up serving. And then John Lennon, in his first solo album, came out with the song, All We're Saying Is, Give Peace a Chance. The Nixon administration continued to place pressure on the North Vietnamese. And in the so-called Christmas bombings that started in late 1972 and continued to early 1973, over 20,000 tons of bombs were dropped on sites in North Vietnam. This was the largest bombing raid since the Second World War. Eventually, a truce was reached. In late January, President Nixon addressed the nation, and he declared that we were close to peace with honor. American troops would withdraw within 2 months. The draft came to an end. And while this led to the end of American involvement in the Vietnam War, in many ways, there was no peace with honor. I'd like to explore the legacy of American involvement in Vietnam next. The legacy of Vietnam and America's involvement in the war was widespread. First of all, we learned that global containment was flawed. It was a complete failure. Containment in Vietnam was a misapplication of the containment doctrine. George F. Kennan, who had actually developed that policy, said, "Why are we in Vietnam?" in later years. And so he was focused on Europe. Secondly, it undermined America's self-confidence. And we had something called Vietnam Syndrome. It seemed as if the United States was becoming a second-rate world power. The loss of life was one of the legacies. About 55,000 Americans died in the war. That was tragic. But compare that to maybe 2 million Vietnamese? Oh, it was awful. And on the right, we see some of the horrors of the Vietnam War, and we see the victims of the war among children in Vietnam. I don't know how many people have been able to visit the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., but it's shown here at a distance. The arrows are pointing to the wall, so to speak, that has the names of the U.S. soldiers and sailors who died during the conflict. In many ways, this is low to the ground. In contrast to the Washington Monument, if you've ever been to D.C., it dominates the skyline of the nation's capital. This is close to the ground and even in a way underground. In the foreground, you see some of the grass, and the wall itself is actually below some of the hill on the other side of the wall. Well, when people are buried, they're often buried underground. And so that was part of the message that the artist was trying to get at with this memorial honoring the dead who lost their lives during the war. Here we see a close-up of the Vietnam Memorial, or the wall. It has the names of the victims of the war. But as you get close to it, you can also see yourself. So not only were the people who died during the war victims of the war, but also the people who visit the memorial, because it had a major impact on American society and not just the soldiers who lost their lives. Well, I hope you learned something new today. And I hope you learned something about American involvement in the Vietnam War. Started with the Truman administration, and each president after that escalated American involvement, but under Richard Nixon, the U.S. got out. Next topic, we'll continue by looking at some of the politics during the 1970s. Have a great day, everybody, and we'll see you online.